Welcome back to Quick Theological Thoughts. I'm Howard Fisher, and today I want to interact with a video, and we'll just start and stop it and see if we can have some fun with it. It's in defense of secularism, which, these kind of things are usually a assumed pragmatic utilitarian type of thing. Let's see if I can pull it up here. So we'll just start and stop it and see where we end up. We'll try to make it a conversation, and I'm sure people that watch this will go, this Christian guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Well, fine. But you got to keep in mind, secularism is something that's just it's just assumed, right? We don't know it. We just assume it. So we got, a secular worldview. Well, I'm not against secular things, right? I have a secular job. It's not a quote unquote Christian job. But my secular job is in God's world. And so Christ is Lord, and he's Lord over all. And if Christ is Lord and Lord over all, then whether something is secular or something is holy, something that we set apart for religion, both things are in God's world. And secularism is not that, right? Secularism is a philosophy that is, I don't want to say it's atheistic, but it doesn't have a grounding in and of itself. Itself is the grounding. It's basically, we're just going to live in a world where we all get along together because there's, we have all these different religious beliefs. It really takes us back to Egypt in a weird sense kind of way. It takes us back to Caesar. It's really a polytheistic religious grounding, right? You can be an atheist and you can be not an atheist. You can be whatever. And so it's a world governed by some kind of philosophy that transcends all these things. And how do we know that that's true? Well, let's see if we can get an argument for that.
The separation of church and state. It's an idea as American as let's do it anyway, or all food should have cheese on it. And yet secularism has been on the decline as a fundamental value of the U.S. government, particularly since the 1950s when under God was added to the pledge.
Separation of church and state is American as apple pie, I guess would even throw another one in there, right? Separation of church and state has been recognized for centuries and centuries and centuries. So what's really being said here is not a separation of church and state, but the role of the state and the philosophy or the religious views of the state itself. That's radically different, right? That's what he's arguing for. Nobody argued for the separation of church and state in the manner of secularism in our founding documents, in our early years, for the first, for decades and decades, going into after the American War for Independence. There were state churches. Massachusetts had a state church well into the 1830s. But they were still considered separate institutions. So the question isn't whether there's a separation of church and state. The question is, how does that work? How does it look? How does it, are there different roles? What's the nature of the state? What's the nature of the church? He doesn't examine any of this in this video other than assume it, right? He just assumes it. And he assumes secularism is the default to make things work. It's the default that what America was founded on. Well, it's just not true. America was a deeply religious nation, deeply religious. And to to think that the 1950s was the beginning of the erosion of separation of church and state is absurd. it's it's just the way people think about these things, and part of it is our modern climate, Christianity. Let's say we have a church state today. The way the left sees it, they see that Christianity is equivalent to Trump. They see the church as equivalent to Trump taking over, the United States, and it's just all baloney. But that's how they see it, and I don't, it's a fantasy land. It's just their fear of religious people, and so they're going to lump everybody underneath Trump, whatever that means. But anyway, let's press on.
And in God we trust replaced e pluribus unum.
I love this. It almost sounds like conspiracy. We used to be completely secular. Our money was just e pluribus unum, out of the many one, or it's, and now we've added in God we trust. We're sneaking in religion. I'm sorry, but the left accuses people like me and people on the right all the time of conspiracy stuff. Well, I'm sorry. This is this is the same thing. It's never about. It's always the other guy that's sinning, right? It's anyway.
In my last video, I went through some of the history of secularism. I talked about how secularism emerged as a fundamental American value in the first place, partially from Christian
Secularism
precepts.
is an American, a fundamental American precept. Secularism. No. The French Revolution and the American Revolution, we call it the American Revolution. It's really the War for American Independence, because one was a revolution, France, and in America, it was not a revolution. We call it a revolution a lot, but it really wasn't. We were not overthrowing the culture. We were not actually overthrowing the government in the sense that France was. We were saying that England was an actually illegitimate government. Read the Declaration of Independence. It's not a secular document. Now, are there, obviously the philosophies of Rousseau of the day, did it influence some things in America? Of course it did. But America was, in fact, the American Revolution would not have happened with 2/3 of the American people. It was 1/3 of Americans that said, we need to, this is illegal, it's immoral, and it's the British government is acting illegitimately and is now illegitimate. And so we cast them off. And so France was an overthrow of everything, right? It wasn't just an overthrow of government. It was an overthrow of public morals and morals and the philosophy, everything. That's not the case in America. That's not what it was about. So in the United States, we had Christianity that, on the one hand, Americans were Christians and we didn't want to go to war, right? It was Romans 13, but the Presbyterians, yeah, those conservative, wascally religious people, that by today's standard, the Presbyterians that gave us the American War for Independence, right? That we would not have gone to war without Presbyterian preachers, would today be considered radical right-wingers. I'm sorry. I have a hard time taking some of this stuff seriously.
But ironically, today America is in practice one of the least secular states in the West, and the main proponents of the erosion of secularism are Christians. I want to argue here that secularism is a universal
Well, we're
good.
trying to erode
for
it,
the members
right?
of
Because
minority
it's eroding us. It's like we live in two different realities here. Anybody who sees the result of our public school system steps back and looks at our children and sees how radically different they're thinking compared to their parents. We have basically farmed out our kids to secularists who have totally indoctrinated our kids with a worldview that is incoherent, irrational, hedonistic, really. It's led to all kinds of if you don't see the problem going on today, then you're part of the problem.
Religions, it's good for non-believers, and it's good for the members of the majority religion,
All right,
too.
it's good.
So join me
Secularism
as I
is
am.
good for all the different belief systems within the United States. By what standard? Where does this come from? Well, it comes from secularism. It comes from naturalistic materialism. Well, how does he know any of this is true? Where does this come from? What is the grounding for this? He doesn't have any grounding for this. It's an assertion. And it's an assertion that he's going to back up with evidence showing showing how practical, pragmatic, utilitarian it all is. But is it?
Answer this question about the separation of church and state. Why should I like that?
I like that because it's biblical. The argument for separation of church and state has gone all the way back into the earliest of biblical times. And we see throughout the Bible where kings try to usurp the role of priests and priests try to usurp the role of kings. And you have to have your battles to push back the other, right? One trying to usurp the other's authority and power. And it's just nothing new. Nothing new here. Little history goes a long way. The ominous music.
First, let's start with those who benefit most obviously from the separation of church and state. Atheists, agnostics, non-believers of all stripes.
This guy totally ignores the Soviet Union. Let's make this an atheistic state. Oh. Let's see how many millions of people we killed over in Russia and Soviet Union, Ukraine, and just ignore all of that. Anytime people died, it was because states became religious, which is what he's going to argue here.
I'm one of these people, and it seems natural that someone who lives without religion would not want to live under a religious authority.
You do, actually. And I've said this on other videos. There is one reason, and one reason only, that you should not be murdered because you're made in the image of God, which is a religious belief, which comes right out of Christianity, and your freedom to be a non-Christian really is grounded in Christianity. Christianity, by definition, doesn't force you to become Christian in the sense of you have to go to this particular church to do this particular thing. However, the role and authority of the state comes from Jesus Christ. And the role of the state, biblically, is to uphold God's law, which defends your right to life. Without that, you don't have anything. Secularism can't make this assertion. How in the world can secularism say, in and of itself, unless it itself is some kind of God, to declare that secularism has is the ultimate authority here to tell you that your life is worthy of protection? Really?
I don't believe that any rules derived through religious dogma rather than rational argument and scientific investigation
really?
are worthy of respect.
That's an assertion. Did the scientific dogma just prove the scientific dogma and therefore it's worthy of respect? Rules that come from religion? Okay, what does he really mean by that? Okay, as a Baptist, I don't think I should be allowed to force my views of baptism, my views of certain religious denominational beliefs that you practice in the church. I can't force that on an atheist or a secularist. Well, duh. But that comes from the Bible itself. Oh, a religious belief. Let's try this again.
I find it annoying when political figures talk about God. Because I don't want
Oh,
them to do a job
you
that has
don't?
anything to do with God.
You don't want them to do a job that has anything to do from God? Who ordains the authority of the state? Well, we the people ordain the authority of the state. Well, there's a sense in which that's true, right? But where is that grounded? Right? Where is it grounded? If it's not from God, then it's willy-nilly. They can do whatever they want. I'm actually far more fearful of, let's say, a Stalin who claims atheism, right? Who claims he's true, because he's really the ultimate. And he's not subject to the lordship of Christ. He's not subject to God's law. He's not subject to the transcending law of God that says murder's wrong. So he just does what he wants because he's God. That's far scarier than a picture of George Bush saying, what? God? Now, I agree with him that religion has been abused in defense of political things that you want in politics. As if secularism doesn't do that, which he's going to get into in just a moment.
God doesn't say anything about what the tax rate should be or whether affirmative action should be implemented to create a more egalitarian society. In fact,
why
when
is
religion does involve
an egalitarian society a good thing? These are just assertions, just pure assertions. He has no grounding for any of this. It's just another assertion.
itself in government, it tends to intervene constantly against my values of individual choice, meritocracy, and social progress. Apparently, God doesn't want women to have the right to choose what happens to their own bodies, despite the fact that the only time abortion is mentioned in the Bible, it advocates drinking a potion that might cause a miscarriage if you suspect that your wife is cheating on you.
We've dealt with this argument in depth in another video as far as the passage, but God doesn't want women to have the right to do with their body. He's not even dealing with that subject in any serious way at all. This isn't even serious. This is just a flippant walk past. Religious people don't want women to have the right to do with their body, and so they want to dominate them and control them and enslave them to the kitchen. Like, no, abortion's wrong because it's murder. We are created by God. And so this is based upon something he's going to mention here in a minute. This is based upon an idea that there's no God, that there's no created order, that there's no created order of the family, that babies are not born through the means of procreation that God has established, which is an ethical system, right? It's created order. So when you're not a creationist, and this guy's obviously not a creationist, then yeah, you can just be flippant, walk right by this. But yet, where does the right to have a bodily autonomy come from? Secularism? Where does that? He doesn't defend any of this. None of it. He just assumes the moral high ground and doesn't even begin to defend it. He just assumes it. We know that women have the bodily autonomy because we said so. Okay, whatever.
I'm told that God doesn't want gays to have the same right to marry as straight people.
Gays don't have the right to marry the same as straight people. Is that really true, though? A gay man can marry a gay woman all day long. It's just the law is, biblical law, is that a marriage has a meaning. It has a definition. And you can't build a society with the blessings from God when you defy the created order. It is a moral issue. These things are moral. And he's just walking right past it. He just assumes that it's silly that we would make, Christians would make such an argument. That's just purely religious. Well, all right. But here, we're going to get the typical argument here against this argument. Here we go.
He doesn't want me to believe that climate change exists or that evolution is a
he
fact.
doesn't want me to believe it. I'm out to make sure you don't believe it. I'm out to make sure it's not public policy. I don't want the public education system teaching atheistic beliefs, because it starts with atheism and ends in atheism, and you're shocked when we produce atheists. Well, yeah, of course I oppose it, but nobody's out making sure that you're not going to be able to believe it. This is just pure bunk. It's just, all right, let's move on to the next point.
Never mind the fact that the Bible says nothing about climate change and barely contradicts evolution at all.
Okay, that's fine. I agree. But notice how this is just taken as fact. Evolution is just fact. So the polar ice caps are retreating because of global warming. We're destroying the planet. And so I read an article and then just saw a BBC documentary. It's on YouTube. That this ice sheet that's been there for 1,000 years has melted away because of climate change. And isn't that terrible? And up on the top of this hill where the ice is receded, they found a bunch of Viking stuff under the ice, a road and some, campsites or whatever, all these things, littered by by Vikings 1,000 years ago. It's like the glaring thing that's jumping out at you is, so did the Vikings live under the ice for 1,000 years or before? How'd that work? Oh, wait, the ice wasn't there 1,000 years ago when the Vikings were there? Oh, and the ice sheet showed up and now it's retreating again? Oh, well, how is that man-made? Were the predecessors of the Vikings driving around in cars polluting the earth? Okay, and the argument for that is the same argument for evolution, which there's no proof. Show me one kind becoming another kind and gaining more and more information. Molecular biology has been demonstrating, in my opinion, that evolution is just not even remotely even possible. And you can't add the magic of time over millions of years to make it work. It's simply, anyway, let's move on.
Unless you read Genesis utterly literally. And that very same book of the Bible that tells me not to lie with a man as I would with a woman also
just
tells me
with
not
that
to eat
typical
shellfish.
Atheistic argument. A man lying with a woman. You Christians say that's wrong. Are you going to force the seafood laws against us all too? Really? As if the Bible doesn't distinguish between these things? Oh, the Bible does distinguish between the moral laws and laws that were to separate the Jews and the Israelites from the rest of the world, right? But just ignore that. In fact, the same text that tells us that a man should not lie with another man as if he's lying with another woman is the same text that tells us, go ahead and read Leviticus 18, that the land will spew the Canaanites out. It will vomit them out because of their wickedness. It doesn't mention anything about shellfish causing that. The Canaanites weren't thrown out of the land because they ate shellfish, if they even ate shellfish. This kind of stuff, it's hard to take serious, and people who say it are just flippant. They just anything they can say to make a Christian look stupid. And if it works for them, in their minds, it's not true. It's not even remotely true. It's completely inaccurate. It's not even a way that you would read the Bible, but that's what these people do. That's what non-Christians who oppose God's law do. It's what they do.
I'm still waiting for that ban on pork and shrimp, by the way. But secularism doesn't necessarily mean that religious people can't have religious opinions.
Secularism
which they advocate
doesn't say religious people can't have religious opinions unless it comes to the state. That's right.
in government. It just means that the government can't act based on religious criteria or discriminate based on religion.
I agree with that from a Christian perspective. It doesn't make any sense to say it from a secular perspective. And the reason is, the only reason why the state can go after a person who's committed murder is because God's law says so. Period. There's no other grounding for it. Secularism doesn't have any grounding for it at all. We've said that over and over.
So while secularism can't protect me from religious people advocating a law against my eating of delicious, crispy bacon, it can protect my right to freely worship bacon and only bacon. It should also protect me from being forced to pray in a public school or be told that bacon worshippers are not real
being
Americans.
Forced in a public school to pray is an issue we need to all deal with, right? I don't believe in state-run schools. The state religion is secularism, and our children, by a monopolistic power, are forced to go to secular schools unless you got money. And then you can send your kids to private schools or you homeschool them. And so you got to pay taxes to pay for your schools and then turn around and pay for private schooling. In any other sphere, that's a monopolistic power. That's a whole nother argument.
In truth, some have eroded secularism, apparently in my favor. The Soviet Union attempted to crack down on religiosity, and as a result, you'll find most Russians today celebrate New Year's as an important family holiday rather
That's
than
the most
Christmas.
understated. The Soviet Union cracked down on religiosity. The Soviet Union state was atheistic. And it was wicked. It was Marxist. Marxism led to the atheism, and guess what was taught in their public schools to all children? Oh, secularism. And guess what they did? They killed some. I've heard numbers as over 100 million people over their reign. And we religious people are the bad guys? Well, this is what he's going to try to say here in a moment.
That was an overreach, and it actually wasn't good for atheists. As an atheist, I don't want you to be forced to think like me or believe what I believe. I arrived at my perspectives about religion through the free exercise of my own intellectual capacity and careful study of the arguments in favor and against the existence of God. I was allowed to think about it and decide on my own. That's more important to me than agreement from other people. If everyone else on earth believed in God but me, I'd feel a little isolated, perhaps. But that's a better feeling than knowing that others have been robbed of their freedom to decide on their own.
But by what standard is it a right? By what standard is it a? Should your right to not believe in God and go to church or what have you? By what standard? Not hearing anything, are you? Me neither.
I grew up in a Jewish household, so I'm also acutely aware of the concerns of religious minorities. I wish I could properly convey to you the sense of dread, revulsion, and fear I felt the first time I saw a swastika painted on a sidewalk.
Christian, we as Christians should recognize the state should protect all equally, right? Under the law. It's not hard. It is not merely a secular concept. Oh, it's actually a Christian concept. The Magna Carta, secular law, was given to us by Christians.
Religious minorities are often the targets of hate crimes. There have even been cases where Sikhs or Hindus have been assaulted by people who thought they were attacking
people are
Muslims.
attacked. That's in violation of God's law. That's just religious.
When the government creates a tone in which some are considered full valid citizens and others are not, it promotes a culture of discrimination and hatred.
And how does secularism accomplish this? On what grounding? By simply saying so? Well, we all evolved equally. no grounding for it. This is just pure assertions.
The only way to have a government that is truly inclusive for all people is to insist that the government authority intervenes in the world of religion only to protect the equal ability of all citizens to freely worship whatever
The
and however
only
they choose.
way we can treat all people equally is if we abandon Christianity and make the government secular. Atheism is the only way. Where does that come from? Right? That's just an assertion. Well, we can look at the world, and when Christians are in power, they favor Christians, and when Muslims are in power, they favor Muslims. Oh, and when secularists are in power, they favor everybody equally. The question here is, what is the role of the state? Okay, where does it come from? Does it come from God or not? Right? If Christianity is the law of the land, just do a thought experiment with me, right? Pretend for a moment that all people are, let's say 90% of Americans are all Baptists and 10% are secular, or maybe they're Muslims, or maybe they're Jews, or whatever. It doesn't matter what it is. Do they have a right under the law to equal protection? Do they have the right under law under the general equity of the Old Testament? Absolutely. Absolutely. And it comes from the Bible. The Bible tells us we are to treat the foreigner that is in the land among us under the law of God, that they are to be, that they deserve general equity, that they deserve equal protection under the law. It's not hard. Thou shalt not murder. It's not hard. How does secularism ground all this? Oh, they don't have anything. It's just asserted.
Except, of course, in cases where said worship interferes with other more fundamental rights. More practically, let's acknowledge the reality of religion in the United States today. According to Pew's religious landscape study, 70% of Americans are Christian. But that subdivides quite a bit. The most popular Christian sects are evangelical Protestantism, with roughly 25% of Americans, and Catholicism, with roughly 21%. That means no matter what your religion, in America you are a member of a religious minority. If the United States were to rule based on a church and officially establish a religion, at the very least 75% of the country would be alienated. And of course, evangelical Protestants subdivide too, their largest component being Baptists at 9.3% of Americans, which subdivides again, with the largest subsect being Southern Baptists, representing just 5.3% of Americans.
All right, so what he's doing here is he's dividing everybody out and going to make everybody a minority, as if all Christians everywhere disagree about the fundamentals of God's law. That isn't, this breaking it down like this is to paint a picture that we're all so fragmented. We have all these different religious beliefs, that we're so radically different that we can't get along unless we're secular. And how is that asserted? Well, let's go back to the colonies when you had disputes within the colonies, right? What eventually had to work itself out? It's like any time period, right? When cell phones hit our culture, it takes time to work out how we're all going to behave and how we're going to use this technology, right? When these colonists all came and to America and they had different beliefs, they had to figure out how to live together. Oh, but Christians have been trying to figure out how to do that for centuries. Nothing new here. So the question was never can Christians, live together. The question is, what is the role of the state and how Christians do live together? Massachusetts has a state church. So can you bring another church into Massachusetts? Well, no. Okay. So if you want to start a different church, you got to go to another state. You got to go to a state that allowed different churches. Okay. Was Massachusetts wrong? And if they were wrong, based on what? What's the grounding? Okay. So you go to Pennsylvania, which had more freedom of religion. Okay. You still have to learn to live with each other, and you still have to figure out what the role of the state is. Where does it get its authority, and to do what, right? What are they going to do with the authority? What's its role? Right? If you don't have that grounded in Scripture, then what? Well, we know during the Reformation period, Baptists were persecuted more than, more Baptists died at the hands of the state than all of the Protestant denominations combined. Okay. So Doug Wilson asked the question this way: was Jesus happy with that? Okay. Was that wrong? And if so, why? And how do we make it right? What's the role of the state? Right? Once we got away from sacralism, which is really the problem here that he doesn't even know about. Once we got away from sacralism and we got into freedom of religion and the federal government not being able to establish a federal government church, that sets the groundwork for religious freedom that people never had in centuries. And so the question is, okay, how does that work? How does that work with Christianity? Because Christianity gave it to us, right? So, okay, let's figure out how are we going to be consistent with that. This guy isn't entertaining any of those kinds of questions because he's not a Christian. It doesn't even occur to him. He's some kind of atheistic person, secularist for sure. So, okay, so he's not grounding any of this. I know I keep saying that, but that's the key, isn't it?
Christianity was a monolith, that 70% of the country believes roughly the same thing, and so we could reasonably establish Christianity as the state religion. Why would that be so bad for Christians? Well, truth be told, secularism isn't just about protecting religious minorities, the 23% who are unaffiliated, or the 15% of Americans who call themselves nothing in particular. Secularism protects the state from the corrupting influence of religion. It also protects religion from the corrupting influence of politics.
Wholeheartedly agree with that part. But it's not secularism. I shouldn't say I wholeheartedly agree. Getting away from sacralism does help with that. Secularism doesn't protect us from that at all. This is just asserted. Secularism has no grounding in anything. So how can it protect anything with other than its own fiat power? It's just assertions.
The truth is that secular power routinely and predictably corrupts religious institutions. Today, the Pope has no authority, and he tells us nice things like you can take your pet to heaven with you. In the Middle Ages, they had different things to say, like let's go invade the Holy Land and kill all the infidels. If you're a Christian and think your pastor would do it much...
The Crusades were far more complex than just simply saying religious people went and beat people up. It's just, I'm sorry. The crusade thing's got to stop because it's just so wrong.
Better job running the country than the snakes in Washington. You're probably right, but that's only true because your pastor
so then
doesn't have
secularism
any power.
doesn't protect us, does it? You just made the argument that if religious people in power, it would be bad, and if secular people in power, it would be bad. And begs the question, and this is where conservative Christians have just kind of accepted the other side's argumentation without thinking through it. Where did we get the term bad from? How do we know it was bad? Oh, the Bible.
Religious authorities had actual authority. That nice, wise person who wants to help out the community would quickly lose his or her post to a spineless, power-hungry ogre.
Where they had a state church, it was illegal for a pastor to take a state position while being a pastor. And it was illegal to have a state position and become a pastor. They saw the separation and they saw that you couldn't mix the two. There's nothing new here. Nothing. And Christians have been dealing with these questions for a long time. I'm sorry, but this is just baloney.
Positions of power attract the worst.
Positions of power
Perhaps
attract the worst people, and we're showing Putin. Well, Putin today has confessed that, he's become a Christian, but Putin came out of the atheistic regime of the Soviet Union. Yes, the atheistic side was bad.
Lord Acton put it best when he remarked that phrase most often misattributed to George Orwell. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power
And
corrupts absolutely.
that's a statement that's good or bad? Is that a moral statement? Is it based in, is there anything, is he trying to convey a moral issue here? Yeah. Oh, so we have different roles, different authorities, of different institutions. One's called the church, one's called the state. What a novel idea.
If you love your church now, imagine just how much you'd love it if it were run by this guy, or this lady.
Nobody's making this argument anywhere. And people that say this kind of thing, I don't know. I don't know what you do. This is just absurd. This is how a leftist sees it. I have no the fear in the leftist heart of religious people is tremendous, right? In the secularist heart is tremendous. They absolutely positively fear religious people, as if they shouldn't fear atheistic religion, atheistic people. The picture of Putin, who's on the left, his name, Trump's accused of wanting to be some kind of tyrant, right? Fair enough. Fine. He wants to be a tyrant. As if Biden didn't try to force millions of people out of work by forcing them, violating not Geneva, violating the law that says you can't force vaccines on people, and then tried to force vaccines on people or you'll lose your job. I almost personally got fired out here in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, because President Biden wanted to fire me. Fire me, little old me.
Then ask yourself, why should I like that?
Because Jesus is Lord, and I prefer Jesus' lordship, giving us the law and explaining to us the separation of powers and explaining to us what the role of the state is versus the role of the church, and explaining to us who's actually in charge. We live in God's world. This is God's world, not man's world. So you can't simply make these assertions over and over and over again. And I'm sorry this was a long program, but I thought it was a fun video. Anyway, so let's think about these things. We can debate it, we can discuss it, we can make comments on it. I'll try to address it if you do. These are things that we need to think more deeply about. And if I'm wrong at points, I'm wrong at points. You got ideas? Throw them out there. Anyway, thanks for watching, listening. God bless. Be good.